What if your guards forced you to fight for your life just to survive another day? Inside Pelican Bay, Guard-Orchestrated, Gladiator fights, exposed. Inside Pelican Bay, a remote fortress of concrete and steel on California's far northern coast. Officially opened in 1989, it was designed to house the so-called worst of the worst. Supermax security. Endless solitary. A new era of control. But within a few years, whispers turned into sworn statements. Behind the sterile walls, something darker was happening. An arena of state-sponsored violence. A place where correctional officers did more than guard prisoners. They allegedly played puppet master. Picture the security housing unit, the SHU. Rows of windowless cells. 23 hours a day in lockdown. A single hour of exercise in a small concrete pen, sometimes called the dog run. Now picture the door opening. A siren wails. 2 prisoners from rival gangs are released into the same yard. No warning. No restraints. Nothing but adrenaline and survival. This was no mistake. According to multiple lawsuits, internal memos and witness accounts, officers were staging these encounters. They called it management. Prisoners called it gladiator fights. The term would enter California's legal history in Madrid versus Gomez, a landmark 1995 federal case. Judge Thelton Henderson's ruling described a culture of stunning indifference to human life. For the first time, the public glimpsed the hidden arena inside Pelican Bay's Supermax. Now imagine you are one of those men. You have spent months, maybe years, in a windowless cell. You are shackled and escorted every time you move. Then suddenly the cuffs are off. You are shoved into the yard. Across from you stands an enemy. A rifle is aimed at your chest from the tower above. The guards are watching. You know the rules. Fight or be killed. This was the twisted calculus of Pelican Bay's control strategy. It was, according to some correctional staff, a way to let the gangs handle their business. According to prisoners, it was legalized blood sport. The story of these fights begins with the opening of Pelican Bay itself. California was grappling with overcrowding, rising gang violence, and public pressure for tough-on-crime policies. The Department of Corrections built Pelican Bay as its crown jewel. Remote, isolated, technologically advanced. A place to break gang networks and crush resistance. But prisons are ecosystems. Every decision by staff can tip the balance of power. By the early 1990s, rival prison gangs like the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family were locked down in the SHU. Contact was minimal. Tension simmered. According to inmate affidavits later filed in federal court, some officers began exploiting those tensions. They learned who hated whom. They kept lists. They used confidential informants. Then they started releasing known enemies into the same exercise pens. Sometimes they waited until one inmate was already out, then opened the door for his rival. The result was predictable, a fight to the death. In one documented incident, an inmate named Jesus Castellanos was stabbed repeatedly after guards released a rival into the yard. In another, 2 prisoners fought for several minutes before officers intervened with gunfire. The pattern was so clear that prisoners began refusing yard time. Some even filed enemy concerns in writing, begging not to be placed with rivals. Yet the incidents continued. What? According to plaintiffs' lawyers in Madrid versus Gomez, it was a management tool. Let gangs police themselves. Create a spectacle to reinforce staff dominance. Sometimes, according to whistleblowers, there was even casual betting on the outcome. By 1993, word of the Gladiator fights reached civil rights attorneys. They began gathering affidavits. They photographed injuries. They subpoenaed internal logs. The pattern was undeniable. The lawsuit named Warden James Gomez and a long list of supervisory staff. Judge Henderson held a lengthy bench trial. He heard weeks of testimony from inmates, experts, and correctional officers. What emerged was a portrait of a prison out of control. Excessive force, dog attacks on handcuffed inmates, shooting of prisoners for minor infractions, and above all, the gladiator fights. In his 1995 ruling, Henderson condemned the practice as unconstitutional. He wrote that Pelican Bay had a culture of violence, and that staff had shown stunning indifference to the health and safety of prisoners. He ordered sweeping reforms. But change was slow. Even after the ruling, incidents continued to surface. Some prisoners alleged that yard mix-ups were still being used as punishment or intimidation. For the men who survived the fights, scars remained. Some left with stab wounds. Others with PTSD. Many were labeled program failures and kept in isolation even longer. This is the dark truth behind California's most infamous Supermax. By the early 1990s, Pelican Bay had already developed a reputation. Remote, unforgiving, a place where sunlight barely reached the concrete yards. Prisoners called the exercise pens dog runs because they resembled kennels more than recreation areas. Chain link fencing overhead, concrete floor below, gun towers looming on all sides. For the officers in those towers, every movement was visible. Every breath could be counted. And yet, fights still broke out. The official line was, "We did not know they were enemies." But patterns told another story. One former inmate described it this way: "I filed enemy concerns every week. I named the man. I gave his CDC number. I begged not to be put with him. And then one day they opened the door and there he was." Another prisoner, testifying under oath, recalled a different tactic. Guards would sometimes test new arrivals by pairing them with known enemies. If the prisoner refused to fight, he risked being labeled a PC, protective custody, a mark of weakness that could follow him for years. This was not just about entertainment. It was about power, control, divide and conquer. Pelican Bay was designed to crush gang leadership. But the very tactics used to break gangs were reinforcing a culture of violence. Civil rights attorney Donald Spector of the Prison Law Office led the legal assault. He and his team compiled hundreds of affidavits. They interviewed former guards who had quit in disgust. They photographed wounds, collected medical records, and subpoenaed internal memoranda. Among the most disturbing documents were yard release logs. They showed names, times, and gang affiliations. Again and again, known rivals were released together. The pattern was no accident. In court, state lawyers argued the prison was overwhelmed. They said mistakes happen. They denied any policy of staging fights. But witnesses contradicted them. Former correctional officer Alfred "Bud" Greer testified he had heard colleagues joking about Gladiator events. Another ex-employee claimed betting pools existed on how long fights would last before shots were fired. Judge Henderson listened to weeks of testimony. He toured the SHU himself. He examined the exercise yards. He read through binders of evidence. His final ruling was scathing. He wrote that the use of force at Pelican Bay may well violate contemporary standards of decency. He singled out the deliberate indifference of staff to inmate safety. He ordered training, oversight, and new protocols for yard releases. The case made headlines across California. "Gladiator fights in state prison," screamed one front page. National outlets picked it up. For the first time, the public saw photographs of the yards where men fought for their lives. But inside Pelican Bay, change was uneven. Some staff resisted new policies. Some prisoners claimed accidental pairings still happened. Others said officers used cell extractions, pepper spray, and attacked dogs more aggressively to maintain control once the fights were under scrutiny. For inmates, the psychological scars lingered. One man described waking up at night to the sound of boots in the corridor, thinking he was about to be dragged to another fight. Another said he refused yard time for years, preferring to rot in his cell rather than risk an ambush. Human rights groups seized on these stories. Amnesty International called for investigations. The American Bar Association cited Pelican Bay as an example of systemic cruelty. Even some legislators began questioning California's Supermax experiment. Meanwhile, the prison's gang problem did not vanish. Nuestra Familia, Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, all still maintained influence. Informants still whispered. Staff still worried about ambushes. But the lawsuit had changed the public narrative. Pelican Bay was no longer just tough on crime. It was now a symbol of the dark side of mass incarceration. Imagine the media footage. Helicopter shots of the prison complex surrounded by redwood forest. Courtroom sketches of shackled inmates testifying. Close-ups of scars and medical records. Headlines scrolling across the screen, "California Prison Brutality Exposed." This is the backdrop of our story. This is the environment in which Gladiator fights became both a management tool and a public scandal. By the mid-1990s, the lawsuit had ended, but the story of the Gladiator fights was still being written in scars and memories. Many of the men who testified in Madrid versus Gomez were still in the SHU. Some had been branded as troublemakers for speaking out. Others were transferred to different facilities only to find that their reputations followed them. In interviews conducted years later, former Pelican Bay prisoners described a kind of double sentence. First, they survived the fights themselves. Then they endured retaliation for telling the truth. Letters smuggled out of the prison spoke of lost mail, delayed legal visits, and cell searches that ended with personal property destroyed. The psychological toll was immense. Clinical experts who testified in court compared long-term solitary confinement to a slow form of psychological torture. Adding forced combat on top of that created what one psychologist called a crucible of trauma. Men developed hypervigilance, nightmares, flashbacks, and explosive anger. Even when released back into general population or paroled, they carried the SHU inside their minds. One former inmate, identified only as MR in legal papers, described a recurring dream. "I'm in the yard again. I hear the door clang. I look up and he's there, my enemy. The guards are above us. I wake up swinging my fists." For correctional staff, the scandal also left a mark. Some resigned. Some faced internal investigations. Others quietly adapted to the new rules and tried to rebuild credibility. A handful became whistleblowers, speaking to journalists and legislators about what they had witnessed. They described a war zone mentality, in which prisoners were dehumanized and violence became normalized. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation eventually implemented integrated yard policies and more detailed classification systems. Checklists were introduced. Computerized tracking of enemy concerns became mandatory. In theory, this reduced the chance of mixing rivals. Yet critics argued the reforms were cosmetic. They said the culture of secrecy and impunity remained. In 2002, the Sacramento Bee reported new incidents of accidental yard releases that ended in bloodshed. Advocates warned that without independent oversight the cycle could repeat. Meanwhile, outside the walls, public perception of Pelican Bay was shifting. Documentaries, newspaper exposés, and human rights reports painted the prison as a symbol of excess, the dark underside of tough on crime. College students wrote theses about the Gladiator fights. Law professors used Madrid versus Gomez to teach Eighth Amendment law. Civil rights groups pointed to Pelican Bay when campaigning against Supermax prisons nationwide. Picture your screen showing a timeline graphic. 1989, Pelican Bay opens. 1990 to 1994, fights, lawsuits, media silence. 1995, federal ruling. 1996 onward, slow reforms, continuing controversy. This timeline anchors our story. It shows how a single prison yard became a stage for a constitutional battle. It shows how the testimony of a few brave inmates cracked open a secret practice. And it raises a bigger question. What does it mean when a state agency entrusted with custody crosses the line into orchestrating violence? Is it mismanagement? Is it policy? Is it a crime? Legal scholars still debate that question. Some argue the Gladiator fights could have supported criminal prosecutions of individual officers under civil rights statutes. But the Department of Justice never filed such charges. Instead, change came through injunctions, training orders, and court monitoring. For the men who lived it, those remedies felt hollow. They wanted accountability, not just new policies. Many will never receive it. This is why the story matters today. Because Pelican Bay's Gladiator fights are not just history. They are a warning about what happens when secrecy and power collide behind prison walls. They show how easily management can slide into brutality. They reveal the hidden cost of Supermax incarceration, not only on prisoners but on the moral fabric of the institutions themselves. As we close Chapter 1, keep this image in your mind. A gray sky over Crescent City. A yard of concrete surrounded by gun towers. Two men facing each other. No choice. No escape. Above them, officers watch from behind bulletproof glass. A whistle blows. Another fight begins. This is the opening of our investigation. This is the true crime story of Pelican Bay's Gladiator fights. In the next chapters we will go deeper. We will trace how this practice emerged from policy, how the lawsuit unfolded, and how the survivors fought for justice. Inside Pelican Bay, beyond the concrete yards and cell doors lies an entire machinery of policy, paperwork, and hidden decisions. Chapter 1 took you into the yard where the fights happened. Now, Chapter 2 will take you behind the glass. We will see how a system of memos, codes, and unwritten rules created the conditions for the Gladiator fights. Imagine an office inside the prison. Fluorescent lights buzzing. A corkboard covered with mug shots and gang symbols. Staff in pressed uniforms leaning over classification charts. This is where yard releases were planned. This is where decisions that looked routine on paper turned deadly in practice. In the early 1990s, California's prison system was in crisis. Overcrowding. Exploding gang violence. Political pressure for tough-on-crime policies. Pelican Bay was the answer. a Supermax designed to lock down gang leadership and break communication. But building a fortress does not automatically bring order. Inside, the same rivalries continued, now compressed into tighter spaces. According to former staff and court records, the SHU became a pressure cooker. Inmates were kept in windowless cells. No contact visits. Limited phone calls. 1 hour of exercise per day in a small pen. Gang leaders sent messages by kites, tiny notes, or coded letters. Informants whispered to staff about who hated whom. In this atmosphere, classification decisions became weapons. A single box checked on a form could put 2 enemies in the same yard. On paper it looked like a routine mix. In reality it was a death sentence. One ex-officer later told attorneys, "We had lists. We knew who was who. It wasn't random." Another said, "It was like running a chessboard. Move the pieces, see who takes who out." For prisoners the process was invisible. They would file enemy concerns, forms listing names and reasons they could not be housed or exercised with certain people. Sometimes the forms were ignored. Sometimes they disappeared. Sometimes they were used as bait. One inmate testified, "I told them in writing. I told them face to face. Next week they put him in the yard with me anyway." This pattern did not emerge overnight. It evolved from the prison's security culture. Pelican Bay was built on the assumption that inmates were irredeemably dangerous. Staff training emphasized control, not rehabilitation. The SHU was described in official manuals as a management tool to neutralize threats. Inside that framework, setting enemies against each other was seen by some as efficient. Less paperwork than an official disciplinary hearing. More immediate than a transfer. By 1992, attorneys from the Prison Law Office and the ACLU were receiving letters from SHU inmates describing staged fights. At first they were cautious. Prisoners exaggerate. Stories get distorted. But then the letters multiplied. The details were consistent. Dates matched medical logs. Names matched incident reports. Donald Spector and his team began assembling a database. They mapped incidents, dates, rivalries, and injuries. A picture emerged of deliberate mixing. They interviewed family members of injured prisoners. They tracked down ex-guards willing to talk off the record. They filed public records requests for use of force reports. Imagine the montage. Stacks of paper on a lawyer's desk. Photographs of stab wounds. Handwritten declarations signed under penalty of perjury. A map of Pelican Bay's SHU yards with colored pins marking incidents. This was not just anecdote anymore. It was evidence. The attorneys decided to build a class action lawsuit. They named it after the lead plaintiff, inmate Von Madrid, and the warden, James Gomez. Madrid versus Gomez would become the most significant prison conditions case of its time. Meanwhile, inside Pelican Bay, tension grew. Word spread that some inmates were talking to lawyers. Some refused yard time entirely, locking themselves in their cells to avoid being set up. Others carried makeshift weapons to yard, just in case. Every door opening became a potential ambush. Even some staff were unnerved. A retired sergeant later told a journalist, "It got out of hand. What started as a way to control gangs became a blood sport." Another said, "We weren't supposed to bet. But guys would. How many seconds before the first stab? How many shots fired before they hit the ground?" For Judge Thelton Henderson, who would eventually preside over the case, the most chilling testimony came from medical staff. Nurses described treating inmates with multiple stab wounds after yard incidents that could have been prevented. Doctors spoke of pressure to downplay injuries in reports. One said, "It was like patching up fighters after a match so they could go back out again." Picture the contrast. On one side, official memos calling Pelican Bay a model of modern corrections. On the other, sworn declarations describing a hidden arena of state-sanctioned violence. This is the machinery behind the arena. It is not one rogue guard. It is a system of classification, informants, and unspoken incentives. A system that allowed gladiator fights to happen under the guise of management. By the time Madrid versus Gomez went to trial, the attorneys had built a mountain of evidence. Inmate declarations, medical records, photographs, internal memoranda, expert opinions on prison management and use of force. But evidence alone does not win a case. They needed to show a pattern. They needed to show intent. And they needed to show that the highest levels of the Department of Corrections either knew or should have known what was happening. To do this, they called witnesses. Prisoners in shackles, escorted by armed guards, took the stand. They spoke quietly, but their words carried weight. They described yard doors opening, rivals stepping out, gun towers above. They named dates, times, and injuries. They described filing enemy concerns that were ignored. They described being punished for refusing yard. Then came the experts. Psychologists testified about the effects of long-term isolation. They explained how hypervigilance and trauma make prisoners more volatile. Use of force specialists testified about policy. They showed how proper classification and yard procedures could have prevented these fights. Finally, they introduced the internal documents. Logs showing rival gang members released together. Memos acknowledging management problems, but not fixing them. Training materials emphasizing control over safety. Imagine the courtroom. Rows of suits and uniforms. Stacks of evidence on tables. Reporters scribbling in notepads. At the witness stand, a gaunt prisoner with handcuffs clinking as he raises his right hand to swear an oath. Judge Thelton Henderson listened. He asked questions. He toured Pelican Bay personally, visiting the SHU and its yards. He walked the same concrete corridors the prisoners walked. He looked up at the same gun towers. He heard the doors clang shut. When he issued his decision in January 1995, it was a thunderclap. He found that conditions at Pelican Bay violated the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. He condemned excessive use of force. He singled out the practice of mixing known enemies in the yard. He ordered immediate reforms. For a moment it seemed like the culture would change. Oversight increased. Staff received new training. Classification reviews became more formal. Prisoners gained a legal framework to challenge unsafe yard assignments. But a Supermax is not easily transformed. Pelican Bay still housed the state's most dangerous and most isolated prisoners. Gang rivalry still ran deep. Secrecy still protected misconduct. Some prisoners continued to allege accidental mix-ups. Human rights monitors warned of retaliation against inmates who testified. Families of prisoners wrote letters to legislators describing ongoing abuse. The case did, however, crack the facade. It showed the public what had been hidden. It created a record. And it inspired further litigation and activism, including the hunger strikes of 2011 and 2013. Picture the ripple effect. Newspapers printing editorials. Documentaries airing late at night. Law students debating the case in classrooms. Family members standing outside Pelican Bay holding photographs of loved ones. This is the machinery behind the arena laid bare. A network of policies, incentives, and blind spots that allowed gladiator fights to flourish. A lawsuit that turned whispers into sworn testimony. And a ruling that, at least on paper, drew a line between management and brutality. We leave the offices and the courtrooms and return to the men inside. They are still in their cells. They are still under 23-hour lockdown. Some now have a glimmer of hope. Others fear nothing will change. Inside Pelican Bay. 2 decades after the first gladiator fights, the prison is quieter but no less suffocating. The security housing unit still holds thousands in near total isolation. Gang leaders are scattered across windowless cells. The lawsuit Madrid versus Gomez is over, but the men are still locked down. Indefinite solitary has become routine. In this environment, a new form of resistance begins to take shape. Not a knife hidden under a mattress. Not a whispered threat. But an act of collective starvation. Imagine a cell barely larger than a parking space. Concrete bed. Steel toilet. Dim light bulb buzzing. A man sits cross-legged on the floor. A plastic tray of food sits untouched. Day 1 of a hunger strike. In July 2011, a group of Pelican Bay prisoners issued 5 core demands. End indefinite solitary confinement. Provide adequate food. Allow educational programs. End group punishments. Create fair criteria for release from the SHU. They sent the demands to the governor, to the Department of Corrections, and to the media. They refused their meals. Within days, thousands of inmates across California joined them. It became one of the largest prisoner protests in state history. Family members gathered outside prison gates holding signs. Civil rights groups amplified their voices. Lawyers faxed updates to journalists. Inside the cells, men sipped only water. Some fainted. Some were hospitalized. At least one died. This is not a spontaneous outburst. It is the product of decades of frustration. The same system that produced gladiator fights has now produced mass starvation. Prison officials at first dismissed the strike. They called it gang-driven. They said the demands were unrealistic. But as numbers swelled, 6,000, 9,000, 12,000, the state could not ignore it. Legislators held hearings. The public began to learn terms like security housing unit and step-down program. Inside Pelican Bay, the men coordinated through kites, tiny notes passed between cells, and through family visits. They built solidarity across racial and gang lines. Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, groups that once fought each other in the yard, now refused food together. Picture the montage. Empty meal trays sliding back out through cell doors. Medical staff checking vital signs. Family members chanting outside. Headlines: Mass hunger strike rocks California prisons. By the third week, some prisoners had lost 20 pounds. Skin hung loose over bones. Guards, many of whom had worked through the Gladiator fight era, watched as the men weakened but did not break. State officials offered minor concessions. A little more clothing. A few more photos and cells. But the core demand, ending indefinite SHU, remained unresolved. The strike ended after 3 weeks with promises of policy review. But by 2013 little had changed. The men prepared for a second, larger hunger strike. This is where our story escalates. The first hunger strike was a warning shot. The second would become a movement. On July 8, 2013, more than 30,000 prisoners across California refused their meals. It was the largest hunger strike in state history. Pelican Bay was its epicenter. News helicopters circled overhead. Lawmakers toured the prison. Editorial boards weighed in. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture condemned California's use of long-term solitary. Inside, men collapsed on their bunks. Medical staff worked round the clock. Some prisoners were force-fed. Others signed "Do not resuscitate" orders. Imagine the sound of thousands of stomachs growling in unison. The silence of a prison refusing to eat. The echo of metal doors and distant chants from families outside. This time the state moved faster. Negotiations began. Senators held hearings. The Department of Corrections unveiled a new step-down program designed to let prisoners earn their way out of the SHU without debriefing, the controversial process of informing on gangs. Civil rights lawyers filed a new class-action lawsuit, Ashker versus Governor of California, arguing that indefinite SHU terms violated the Constitution. The hunger strike gave the case urgency and media power. Picture the ripple effect. Aerial shots of the prison. Graphs showing solitary confinement numbers dropping. Families hugging outside visiting rooms. Headlines: California ends indefinite solitary confinement. By 2015, a landmark settlement was reached. California agreed to stop holding prisoners indefinitely in the SHU based solely on gang affiliation. Thousands were transferred out of Pelican Bay's SHU into general population or lower security units. For many, it was the first time in decades they had seen open sky without chain link overhead. The first time they had touched another human being without handcuffs. The first time they had eaten in a room with others. This is the aftermath of the Gladiator fights and the hunger strikes. The same men once forced to fight in the yard had now fought a different battle. A battle of endurance, law, and public opinion. And they had won at least part of the war. But victory was incomplete. Some prisoners remained in solitary for disciplinary reasons. Mental health damage was irreversible. Families mourned those who had died before reform arrived. And staff culture changed only slowly. Yet the hunger strikes marked a turning point. They showed that even inside the most secure prison in California, collective action was possible. They showed that the hidden world exposed in Madrid versus Gomez had not been forgotten. As Chapter 3 continues in Part 3, we will meet individual prisoners whose lives changed because of the settlement. We will look at the slow reintegration of SHU inmates into general population. And we will ask what Pelican Bay represents today, a reformed institution or a monument to a darker era. After the 2015 settlement, Pelican Bay entered a new phase. Reporters were finally allowed limited tours of the SHU. Photographs showed rows of empty isolation cells. Politicians declared victory over indefinite solitary. But for the men who had lived inside those cells for decades, freedom came with new challenges. Picture an inmate stepping into a crowded dining hall for the first time in 20 years. The noise, the smells, the simple act of sitting shoulder to shoulder with other people. For many it was overwhelming. Hypervigilance built in isolation made them flinch at every movement. Some broke down in tears. Civil rights groups tried to provide support. Counselors visited. Law students offered legal aid. Families traveled hundreds of miles to meet loved ones newly transferred out of the SHU. Reintegration was slow. Some men thrived. Others struggled with paranoia and nightmares. A few committed new crimes inside prison and were returned to segregation. Even as numbers in the SHU dropped, California built new high-security units. Critics warned that without culture change, the cycle could repeat. Prison officials insisted the step-down program was working. Independent monitors published mixed reports. Imagine the juxtaposition on screen. On one side, official press releases boasting of reform. On the other, a former SHU prisoner sitting in a tiny apartment after parole, staring at the wall because open spaces feel unsafe. The hunger strikes had shifted policy, but they had also shifted the public conversation. Before 2011, few Californians knew what security housing unit meant. By 2015, it was headline news. Journalists produced documentaries. Universities hosted panels. Lawmakers cited Pelican Bay when drafting new limits on solitary confinement for juveniles and the mentally ill. Some of the men who had organized the strikes became advocates from inside. They wrote op-eds. They mentored younger prisoners. They recorded oral histories for researchers. They wanted the world to remember what had happened behind those walls. Think of the symbolism. The same gangs that once fought each other in staged yard battles now cooperating to fight a legal battle. The same prison that epitomized control becoming a case study in collective resistance. Yet Pelican Bay remained a supermax. The fences and towers were still there. The remote location still made family visits difficult. And solitary confinement had not been abolished, only redefined. Some prisoners still spent years alone for disciplinary reasons. Mental health care remained under strain. For many Californians, however, Pelican Bay's story had become a mirror. A mirror reflecting the costs of mass incarceration, of secrecy, of power exercised without oversight. The Gladiator fights of the 1990s led to the hunger strikes of the 2010s, which led to reforms in the 2020s. But each step left scars. As our documentary closes this chapter, picture a wide aerial shot. Pelican Bay State Prison seen from above at dusk. Rows of concrete buildings fading into forest. A cold Pacific wind rolling in from the ocean. Inside, men eating dinner together in a dining hall that once felt unimaginable. Some smiling faintly. Some still looking over their shoulders. This is the aftermath of a hidden war. It is the third act of our true crime story. From Guard-Orchestrated Gladiator fights, to mass hunger strikes, from secrecy to exposure, from indefinite isolation to tentative reform. And it leaves us with a question. When a system built on punishment tries to reform, can it truly change? Or do the ghosts of the past haunt every corridor? As we move into the next part of this series, we will follow individual stories. Men who left the SHU, families who waited, and staff who tried to rebuild. We will see what Pelican Bay represents today, a reformed institution or a monument to a darker era of California justice.